A veteran walked into a hardware store with his service dog. Calm. Quiet. The scars of war hidden beneath his silence, but the owner took one look at the vest and told him to leave. No pets allowed. The man said nothing. He just walked out. But the next day, an army general showed up, in full uniform, and what happened next left the entire town stunned and forever changed. If you believe service deserves respect, type respect in the comments. Michael Avery pushed open the door to Whitmore's hardware with the ease of a man who had walked through heavier ones in his time. The bell above the door jingled, a bright sound in an otherwise muted space filled with aisles of tools, coiled garden hoses, and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. He paused just inside the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer interior, his left hand instinctively dropping to rest on the thick fur at his side. Titan stood tall beside him, a black German shepherd, with a chest-like armor and eyes that flicked between shelves and shadows with trained alertness. His vest was clean, well-maintained, and clearly marked. Service dog, do not distract. Beneath that, a smaller patch read, PTSD, support, veteran handler. They moved forward in step, the syncopation of soldier and dog, each aware of the other's rhythm. Michael's boots, scuffed but polished, made a soft thud against the linoleum. His broad shoulders, slightly stooped from time and wear, still carried the bearing of someone who once commanded respect in open fields and briefing rooms alike. His hair, once coal-black, had surrendered to gray at the temples. A scar beneath his right ear caught the overhead light as he scanned the shelves. He needed wood screws. Nothing fancy, just enough to fix a drawer that had given up under the weight of too many memories in a kitchen drawer. Titan moved like a shadow beside him, tail still, ears forward. Not sniffing, not wandering, working. A woman passed them in the opposite aisle and did a quick double-take at the dog. Michael felt it, like radar, how people's gazes would rest longer than they should. Some eyes held curiosity, others suspicion, a few gratitude. He'd learned not to expect the latter. As he approached the counter with a box of screws in hand, a young employee looked up, offering a practiced smile, one that faltered slightly as his gaze dropped to Titan. Sir, you can't have pets in here," he said, trying to sound polite. Michael's voice was steady. "He's not a pet, he's a service animal." The employee blinked, uncertain. "Let me get the manager." Michael nodded. He'd seen this play out before. Titan remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Michael's hand, waiting for the next signal. The calm before whatever came next. Some battles weren't fought with bullets or commands. Some began with a bell over a door and a service vest someone didn't bother reading. Michael Avery lived in a small single-story house at the edge of town, the kind with creaking floorboards and a porch that sighed when you stepped on it. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. And quiet these days was everything. His mornings began the same way. Coffee, brewed slow, dark, and strong. Titan would rise when Michael did, stretching with a silent yawn before sitting patiently near the back door. They'd take a short walk down the wooded trail behind the house. No leash needed. Titan never strayed far, always glancing back to check his partner's pace, ears alert to more than just squirrels or rustling leaves. He was listening to Michael, too, watching for the tremor in his hands, the shift in breath, the signals that something inside might be going sideways. PTSD didn't follow a schedule. It didn't ask permission. Some days it was the sound of a car backfiring that yanked Michael into a memory that didn't belong in peacetime. Other days it was nothing at all, just the weight of something invisible pressing against his chest, heavy as any rucksack he ever carried. That's when Titan would come. He knew before Michael did. When the sweat started, when the rhythm of breath turned jagged, when Michael's fingers started to curl without him noticing. Titan would press against his leg or rest his head across Michael's lap, grounding him, anchoring him to the now. A silent reminder, you're home, you're safe, I'm here. The VA had offered group therapy, pills, pamphlets. Michael tried all of it, out of duty, if not belief. But nothing cut through the darkness like the steady presence of the dog who had once dragged him 300 feet to safety after an IED tore through their convoy. Titan had earned more than a patch and a vest. He had earned trust. At night, when the house grew too still and the air too heavy, Michael would wake with a gasp, the ghosts of war still clinging to him. And Titan would be there, always there, pacing at the side of the bed, or lying just close enough that his breathing gave Michael something to match his own, too. The dog had a way of reminding him in those shattered hours that survival wasn't an accident. It was a bond. Michael didn't speak much anymore, not unless he needed to. The war had taken a lot. Friends, years, peace. But what it hadn't taken, what it couldn't take, was the companionship of the one being who never questioned the battles still being fought inside him. Titan didn't ask for thanks. He asked to stay close. And that Michael could give. Stan Whitmore had owned the hardware store for nearly 20 years, and in all that time, he ran it by one rule: his. He liked things neat, predictable, no nonsense. When he looked up from his clipboard and saw the black German Shepherd beside Michael Avery, he didn't see discipline or service. He saw a liability. Fur in the air. A threat to the illusion of control he'd maintained over rows of pliers and paint cans. "No pets," Stan snapped, stepping out from behind the counter like he was about to handle a shoplifter, not greet a customer. Michael turned slowly, calmly, the way someone does when they've seen far worse than confrontation in a small-town store. His voice was steady, free of anger, heavy with something deeper. "He's not a pet, he's a service dog." Titan stood motionless at Michael's side, vest clearly visible, posture rigid but unthreatening. The tags on his collar didn't jingle. He'd been trained not to make unnecessary noise. Even now, with tension in the air, he didn't so much as twitch. Stan didn't bother looking at the vest. "Rules are rules. I don't allow animals in here. You'll have to leave." Michael reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a laminated card. Titan's certification, clearly marked with the seal from the Department of Veterans Affairs. He held it out without a word. Stan didn't take it, didn't even glance at it. "I don't care what kind of card you've got. You're not special," he said. "We've got food-grade materials here, customers with allergies. You can shop somewhere else." A silence settled, thick, uncomfortable. A woman across the aisle leaned over her shopping cart to get a better view. A younger man near the hammers paused, phone raised just enough to start recording. The store wasn't big, and the words had echoed louder than Stan might have intended. Or maybe just loud enough. Michael looked down at Titan, whose eyes were fixed on him, waiting for the next cue. "I served 28 years, Michael said, not as a boast, but as a truth. He saved my life, more than once." Stan crossed his arms. "Doesn't mean you get to bring a dog in here." Michael's jaw flexed once, a silent response. Then he nodded, just once, more to Titan than to anyone else. They turned together, leaving behind the aisle of forgotten nails and rusted prejudices. As the door closed behind them, no one moved to open it again. Not yet. The tremor started in Michael's right hand. Not a shake exactly, but a subtle stiffness, like the muscles were remembering something they'd rather forget. It was the kind of warning sign only someone like Titan would notice, and he did, immediately. Without hesitation, the dog leaned gently against Michael's leg, applying pressure just above the knee, grounding him in the here and now. Michael inhaled through his nose, slowly, deeply. His voice stayed level as he extended the laminated card once more. He's registered, certified, legally protected under the ADA. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He just stood there, tall but tired, offering understanding to a man unwilling to receive it. Stan Whitmore didn't look at the card. His lips thinned as he pointed toward the door. "Out," he said. "Now. Or I'll call the police." The store seemed to tilt for a second, just slightly, just enough for Michael's breath to catch in his throat. Somewhere far off, in a desert no one in that store had ever seen, the same tone of command had preceded shouts, sand, and gunfire. His fingers twitched, a phantom pain igniting in his shoulder even though the shrapnel had been dug out years ago. Titan stayed pressed to his leg, solid, steady. He glanced up at Michael, eyes focused, waiting for permission to do more. But this wasn't a firefight. There was no enemy to disarm, no bunker to breach, just a store owner clinging to ignorance like it was law. A few feet away, a mother gripped her toddler's hand and stepped back into the aisle, whispering something about not getting involved. The teenage boy with the phone had angled the camera higher now, recording everything, preserving humiliation. Michael lowered the certification card slowly, not in defeat, but with the care of a man placing a folded flag into a widow's hands. "He's not a threat," he said softly. "He's the reason I'm still standing." Stan didn't flinch. Last warning. Michael met his gaze. The silence stretched, long and heavy. Then he turned. Titan pivoted in unison, still at his side, still ready. They walked toward the door together, each step louder in its restraint than any shouted protest could have been. As the bell jingled overhead and the door swung closed behind them, no one said a word. But the weight of everything unspoken lingered in the aisles like smoke from a distant war. The moment Michael turned toward the exit, the room changed. You could feel it in the air, thicker, sharper. A shift from casual browsing to collective unease. Customers who had been flipping through leaflets or comparing power drills paused mid-motion. Eyes followed him. Not with empathy. Not yet. With curiosity. The kind people reserve for accidents on highways or stories they don't understand. Someone near the paint aisle whispered, "What's happening?" Another voice, older, brittle, answered quietly, "He brought a dog in. Store doesn't allow them." It wasn't what they said, it was how they said it. Like it was obvious, like it was Michael's fault for not reading the invisible script. Michael kept his head down, Titan still walking tight to his side, never breaking stride. They moved as one, practiced, precise, and proud, but even precision couldn't keep the heat from crawling up Michael's neck. A woman in a crisp blazer, sunglasses perched high on her head despite being indoors, leaned toward her friend and muttered, "It's just for attention, these veterans and their issues." Michael heard it. Not loudly, but clearly enough. Words don't have to be shouted to wound. Some just slide beneath the skin like broken glass. He didn't stop walking, didn't respond, just swallowed the burn behind his ribs. Then came the click. That subtle, unmistakable sound of a phone recording. A teenager stood by the battery display, his thumb poised over the screen, capturing the moment like it was a scene from a show. His friend smirked beside him. "Wait till this hits TikTok," the boy whispered. Michael's shoulders tightened. His feet felt heavier. His boot soles dragged just enough to betray the weight pressing down on him. Not the years in uniform, not the pain in his reconstructed knee, the humiliation. The kind of humiliation that doesn't come from confrontation, but from silence. The kind that blooms when people who could have said something, done something, simply watched. By the time he reached the door, the store had fallen quiet. No beeping registers, no small talk, just the low buzz of judgment and phones held chest high. Titan stepped ahead, nudging the door open with his muzzle. Ever the soldier, always clearing the path. Michael paused under the doorway, back to the room, shoulders squared. For a split second, he looked like a man bracing against incoming fire. Then he stepped into the sunlight, and the door swung shut on everything he'd hoped he wouldn't have to relive. Michael didn't say a word as he crossed the threshold of the hardware store. The door, sighing, closed behind him like it, too, was tired of witnessing quiet cruelty. He could still feel the eyes on his back, the weight of judgment clinging to him like a second shirt. Damp, heavy, unwanted. But he didn't stumble. He didn't curse. He didn't turn around and demand understanding. He just walked, shoulders squared, chin lifted, the posture of a man who had saluted flag-draped coffins and given orders that couldn't be taken back. There was no flare of anger, no barked response, only the silence that settles in men who have carried too much for too long. Dignity wasn't about defiance. Not for Michael. It was about walking through shame without letting it define you. Titan moved like a shadow beside him, every step precisely in rhythm, his body a shield even when the threat was unseen. His head was up, ears alert, scanning the sidewalk as they emerged into the mid-afternoon sun. They didn't need words. The dog knew. Titan always knew. The hardware bag still clutched in Michael's hand felt heavier than it should have. A simple box of screws, bought with quiet patience, now carried the memory of a wound that had nothing to do with flesh. He tightened his grip on it anyway. Some part of him needed to feel something solid, real. As they reached the sidewalk, he glanced briefly at their reflection in the store's front window. Man and dog aligned in silhouette, one limping slightly, the other unwavering. A soldier and his second shadow. No one followed. No one apologized. He heard laughter somewhere down the street, not cruel, just ordinary. Life moved on, unaware that just a few feet away a man had been made to feel like less than what he was. Not by war, not by trauma, but by indifference. Titan bumped his leg again, a small nudge, just enough to say, "I'm still here." Michael's breath caught. He nodded. Once, to the dog, to himself, to whatever part of the world still believed dignity had weight. They crossed the street in silence, the traffic pausing instinctively as if recognizing the march of something solemn. He found an empty bench and sat down slowly, not from exhaustion, but from the pressure of holding composure too long. Titan eased in beside him, resting his head on Michael's boot, and for a long moment they sat that way. Man and dog, still whole, still standing. The bench wasn't much, just old wood slats bolted into concrete arms, weathered by time and long-forgotten conversations. But to Michael, it might as well have been sanctuary. He eased down onto it with the stiffness of someone used to pain, the kind that settled into joints and memory with equal permanence. Titan followed without hesitation, circling once before lying at his feet, head gently coming to rest atop Michael's worn boot, as if to remind the world, and Michael, that he was still on duty. Michael pulled off his cap and wiped his brow with the back of his hand, the salt of old sweat mingling with the sting of newer humiliation. The sun was warm against his skin, a small kindness in a day that hadn't offered many. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. That posture soldiers knew so well, the in-between pose. Not at ease, not at attention, just waiting, breathing, enduring. Across the street, the hardware store stood quiet, its window glass reflecting the world but letting nothing in. No one had come out, no one had followed. The customers inside would return to their shopping, the manager to his clipboard, the phones would stop recording, and the moment would disappear. Everywhere except where it mattered most. Michael didn't need a replay. He'd lived enough scenes worth forgetting. Titan stirred slightly, then settled again, his eyes flicking toward every car that passed, every step on the sidewalk. But mostly, he watched Michael. Always Michael. For a long moment, they said nothing. There were no commands, no consolations. Just the shared quiet of men who'd once faced fire and sand, and the kind of heat that didn't come from sunlight. Michael glanced down at the dog, his fur beginning to gray around the muzzle, his breathing slow and steady. It wasn't lost on him that Titan had aged with him, step for step, never flinching, never falling behind. Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photo from his wallet. The edges were soft with time. It showed a younger version of himself, dusty and bleeding on a gurney, eyes barely open. And beside him, Titan, younger, sharper, but unmistakably the same. He looked at the image for a moment, then tucked it away. "Still watching out for me," he murmured, not to the dog, but to the memory. Titan didn't move. He didn't need to. Loyalty, real loyalty, doesn't require acknowledgement. It just endures. Michael held the photograph between fingers that had once gripped rifle triggers and field dressings, fingers that now trembled only when the past came too close to the surface. The paper was soft with wear, creased at the corners. Its colors faded to the quiet hues of memory. Brown dust, dull green fatigues, the dark crimson that marked pain too fresh to speak aloud. Iraq, 2006. He remembered the day like it was branded behind his eyes. The sky had been the color of ash, choked with heat, and something that smelled like melted metal and fear. The building had gone down in seconds. One moment standing, the next a shuddering roar of stone and screams. He remembered the impact, the weight of rebar crushing his shoulder, the flash of pain that made time pause. And then he remembered Titan. The photo showed it clearly. Michael slumped on a stretcher, his uniform ripped and soaked in blood, eyes half open, half gone. And beside him, Titan, younger and leaner, fur streaked with grime and soot, muzzle red where he'd clawed and dug through concrete and steel to reach his handler. No one had trained him for that. No command had been given. But Titan had gone in anyway, because that's what brothers do. Michael looked down at the dog now lying quietly at his feet, the graying fur around his snout a testament to time's steady march. Titan wasn't as fast these days. His joints clicked when he stood too quickly. But the soul of him, the resolve, the vigilance, hadn't aged a day. That fire still burned behind his eyes, the one that told Michael without words, "You fall, I find you." He traced the outline of Titan's image in the photo, thumb moving gently over the faint shape of his vest. Back then, still new, still bright. The tags had glinted under the desert sun. Now they sat dull and heavy on his collar, more symbol than necessity. Michael sighed and tucked the photo back into his wallet, sealing it between leather folds like a prayer too sacred for display. He glanced around the street, the passers-by oblivious to the war story unfolding at a bench they didn't see. "Most people look at you and see a dog," he said softly, glancing down at Titan. "But they never saw you crawl through fire to get to me." Titan's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but he didn't lift his head. He didn't have to. Some loyalty doesn't need to be proven twice. By nightfall, the video had been watched nearly 10,000 times. It was shot vertically, as they often were, shaky, grainy, incomplete. 39 seconds of discomfort captured through a teenager's lens, a glimpse into something deeper than the kid holding the phone could ever understand. The caption read simply, "Guy gets kicked out for bringing his dog into Whitmore's hardware LOL." It opened with Michael's voice, calm, controlled. "He's not a pet, he's a service dog." The angle was low, tilted slightly, catching Titan's vest in full view, clear as the sunlight outside. The camera jerked when Stan Whitmore's voice cut in, louder, sharper. "Don't care, out, or I'm calling the cops." The teen had filmed right through it, through Michael's quiet resistance, through Titan's stillness, and the final frame was the bell above the door as Michael walked out, silent, dignified, exposed. Within hours, it was everywhere. People shared it with fire in their captions. "This is disgusting. A hero treated like garbage. We can do better." Some typed in all caps. Some used hashtags that had nothing to do with service dogs and everything to do with outrage. But not every comment came with compassion. If he's that messed up, he shouldn't be in public. Probably faking it. These guys milk that PTSD stuff all the time. Rules are rules. He should have left the mutt at home. Michael didn't read the comments. He never did. Not after his first interview years ago, when he tried explaining what war did to a man's nervous system only to be called weak by people whose biggest fight was over a parking space. But others did. Veterans started sharing the clip. Some wrote about their own service dogs. Others just said, "This was me, too." A former combat medic in Nebraska posted a photo of his dog and wrote, "That could have been us today." A Gold Star mother commented, "I wish my son had someone like Titan. Maybe he'd still be here." By morning, the video had crossed state lines. People weren't just watching. They were remembering. That not all wounds bleed. That sometimes a soldier's final battlefield isn't sand or smoke, but a place where they're made to feel small for needing help. And somewhere in the scroll of it all, someone tagged a name. Not a journalist, not a politician, a general. And the tide began to shift. In a quiet study 2,000 miles away, General Alan Harrow sat alone beneath the steady hum of a desk lamp. The light cast long shadows across shelves lined with citations, medals, and faded photographs of younger men in desert camouflage, some of whom never made it home. The room smelled of old books, leather, and the faint sting of military-grade polish. He had long since retired, but no soldier ever really leaves the field. Not entirely. Some things stay buried in the sinew of the body. Muscle memory, instinct, silence. Others just live there, quietly ticking like mines that were never disarmed. The video came to him through a private group chat of former commanders. No commentary, no context, just a link. He clicked it and watched in silence. It didn't take long. The image of the man, older now, weathered, shoulders stiff with discipline, hit him in the chest like an unexpected wind. The dog, too, registered instantly. Harrow had seen that shepherd before. Iraq, 2006, a collapsed structure. Screams over comms, blood in the dirt. Titan. He hadn't known the handler's name then. Just another brave soul extracted from hell by a creature who defied everything science thought it knew about loyalty. But now he knew. Michael Avery. The same man who once stood in a blown-out schoolhouse doorway and called in coordinates that saved half of Bravo Company during a midnight ambush. The same man who refused evac until the last soldier boarded. The man who'd walked with a limp ever since, but never once let it define him. General Harrow leaned forward in his chair, one hand gripping the carved edge of his desk, the other forming a tight fist against his leg. The screen paused on Michael exiting the store, dog at his side, head held high despite everything collapsing around him. "That man saved lives," Harrow muttered. Not for effect, not to anyone in particular, but because truth sometimes demands air. He sat there for a long moment, watching the still frame, his jaw clenched tight enough to ache. Then he stood up. He took his phone from the desk, scrolled to a contact labeled simply Command Support, and dialed. As the line rang, he reached across to a framed photo on the wall. Bravo unit, standing in the dust, Titan sitting tall in front. It was time someone reminded the country what service really looked like. The first thing General Harrow noticed wasn't the handler. It was the dog. He watched the video again, this time slower, eyes narrowing with precision. Not just at the vest or the markings, but the stance. Shoulders square, head alert, body taut yet calm. It was the posture of a working dog trained for more than obedience. It was the stance of a warrior. Titan. The name came back like a sudden memory caught in smoke. Years peeled away in an instant. Iraq. Camp Resolute. Joint Operations Command. Titan had been there. Black coat, slick with desert sweat. Eyes sharp as steel. Never more than a breath away from his handler. One of the few military dogs Harrow had seen who didn't just follow commands but anticipated them. A living line of defense assigned to perimeter detail but trusted by everyone, including the brass. Titan had once stood outside Harrow's own command post for nearly 6 hours during an unexpected lockdown. The base was on edge, reports of insurgent movement just beyond the wire. It was over 100 degrees in the shade, and the wind blew sharp with sand. Harrow had glanced out the window once, just briefly, and saw the shepherd standing there, unflinching, watching the horizon as if it owed him something. That image had stayed with him, a dog alone in a storm, still holding the line. He'd never known the handler then, just a shape in a helmet, always nearby, always quiet. A man doing his job without need for notice. Michael Avery. But now the faces matched. The lines of time had filled in the rest. This wasn't just another mistreatment of a veteran. This wasn't a headline. This was personal. Titan had once kept the general safe. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. Literally. Harrow remembered stepping out of the command trailer late one night, and Titan blocking his path with a low growl. Seconds later, an improvised explosive had been found wired to a supply truck just yards away. Harrow hadn't doubted the dog since. He watched the footage of the store again, this time with a knot in his throat he couldn't name. Seeing Titan turned away, dismissed as just another pet, felt like a betrayal. Not of rules, but of memory. "Damn it," he whispered under his breath. This wasn't a story he could scroll past. This was a debt. General Harrow stared at the frozen frame of the video one last time before closing the laptop with quiet finality. Outside his window, the sky was softening into dusk. The clouds dipped in gold. It looked peaceful, but peace, he knew, didn't mean silence. Sometimes it meant stepping into noise with purpose. He picked up the landline on the corner of his desk. An old thing, black, heavy, stubborn in the way it refused to be replaced by newer plastic. He didn't scroll through contacts. He knew the number by heart. The line clicked, a pause. Then a voice answered on the second ring. "This is Colonel Davis." "It's Harrow," he said. Another pause, sharper this time. "Sir, I'm going to need transport clearance for tomorrow morning. Civilian. Low profile." "Yes, sir. Where to?" General Harrow gave the name of the town, a place barely on a map. Not the kind of place you'd send a 4-star general unless something had gone deeply wrong. "Understood," the colonel replied. No further questions. That was the advantage of command, and of reputation. The call lasted under a minute. Harrow hung up and sat for a moment in the hush that followed, his fingers tapping slowly on the desk's edge. He didn't need to think it through. He'd already done that. He just needed to move. He stood and walked over to a nearby shelf, pulling a small velvet box from behind a row of old campaign coins. He opened it carefully. Inside sat a polished silver pin, an insignia once worn by members of his personal command unit. Only 7 were ever given. Titan had earned his when no human could reach that truck in time. By morning, Harrow was in uniform. He wore it not for spectacle, but for clarity. Some messages are best delivered without question. At the airport, a staff sergeant met him on the tarmac with a duffel already packed. Harrow boarded the small government-chartered plane without fanfare. No aides, no press, just mission. He looked out the window as the aircraft rose into a sky that hadn't yet decided on its weather. Below, the world spun on, oblivious. But somewhere down there was a town where a veteran had been shamed, and a soldier with 4 legs had been forgotten. And General Alan Harrow was coming to remind them. The sun sat high in the sky, casting sharp angles across the storefronts along Main Street. It was the kind of day where not much happened. Lunch specials scribbled on chalkboards, retirees nursing coffee refills, the town moving at its usual quiet pace. But that pace stumbled slightly when a black government SUV rolled to a stop outside Whitmore's Hardware. It didn't screech or roar, it simply arrived, and that was enough. A boy on a skateboard paused mid-kick. A pair of landscapers leaned on their rakes. The barber from across the street looked up from his paper, squinting through the glare. The back door of the SUV opened. The first thing to emerge was a polished black shoe, followed by a creased dress uniform so sharp it looked like it had been pressed with a ruler. General Alan Harrow stepped into the sunlight with the ease of a man who had worn rank long enough to forget about it. His medals caught the light, 2 rows of color and steel, each one a story that no longer needed to be told. The sun caught on the silver eagle at his collar. There was no mistaking who he was. Not a politician, not press, military, real military. His posture was flawless, the kind that made civilians straighten without realizing why. He didn't look around for directions. He didn't check his phone. He just looked at the door in front of him as if it were a target. Inside the hardware store, the chime of the door opening had just faded when the general stepped through. The conversation stilled almost immediately, like someone had turned down the volume on the entire room. A young cashier stood frozen behind the counter, her hand still mid-scan over a pair of gardening gloves. Stan Whitmore looked up from his clipboard, his brow creasing. He took a single step forward before stopping short, his mouth slightly open. General Harrow didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. He walked with purpose across the old tile floor, every movement efficient, deliberate. His uniform made no sound, but the silence around him felt louder than any entrance. People didn't know why he was there. Not yet. But they could feel it, rising through the stillness like a weather front rolling in. This wasn't routine. This wasn't random. Respect had just walked through the door. And it wasn't smiling. The moment General Harrow stepped fully into the store, the atmosphere changed. The air thickened, not from heat or noise, but from the heavy hush that follows authority. Real authority. The kind that doesn't need to be asserted because it announces itself in presence alone. Customers stopped moving. A man comparing socket wrenches lowered them slowly to the shelf, eyes locked on the uniform. A woman pushing a cart full of planters stood frozen, hand resting lightly on a terracotta rim. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet. The cashier at the front counter, no more than 20, blinked rapidly and straightened her name tag. She tried to speak, to say something. Welcome, maybe, or can I help you? But her mouth worked without sound. A single syllable made it out, cracked at the edges. Sir? General Harrow didn't respond. He didn't have to. His gaze swept the store once, not in judgment but in assessment. It was the look of a man who'd entered a compound under threat and needed to know every exit, every variable. He carried himself not like a man on a visit, but like one on a mission. From the back hallway, behind the paint aisle, the owner emerged. Stan Whitmore. He had a clipboard in one hand, a pencil tucked behind his ear, and the familiar look of someone about to insist on control. But when he saw Harrow, something shifted. His steps faltered, his brows pinched, and for the first time in a long while, Stan looked unsure. He didn't recognize the man, but he recognized the uniform. "Can I help you?" Stan asked, his voice attempting to steady itself as he stepped forward. There was no answer yet. Instead, what came was the collective shuffle of phones being pulled from pockets, raised with hesitation, screens lighting up one after the other like silent beacons. A teenager near the key-cutting machine angled his phone with practiced precision, already streaming. People weren't just watching anymore. They were recording. Because they knew, somehow, someway, that whatever was about to happen wasn't ordinary. This wasn't just a customer complaint, it was a reckoning. And no one wanted to be the one who'd have to ask later what they missed. In that silence, in that breathless moment between questions and consequences, the store became a courtroom, and the truth was about to be read aloud. General Harrow moved through the aisle with a precision that felt more like choreography than walking. His boots clicked softly on the floor, each step measured. He made no gesture to the phones aimed at him, no acknowledgement of the silent audience holding its collective breath. All of his attention was fixed on the man behind the counter. Stan stood with his clipboard still in hand, as if it might shield him from whatever this was. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. A faint line of sweat had formed beneath his collar. When Harrow reached the counter, he said nothing at first. He simply reached into the folder tucked beneath his arm and removed 2 documents. The first was a service dossier. Titan's, not Michael's. A photo clipped to the top showed a younger version of the black German Shepherd, seated in desert sand, flanked by soldiers. The K-9 Division seal stamped in red ink. Below it, lines of text. Multiple deployments. 5 confirmed rescues. Purple Heart recipient. Beside it, Harrow placed a letter on official stationery. The seal at the top was unmistakable. Department of Defense. The signature at the bottom belonged to a man who once sat at the cabinet table of a president. Then Harrow looked up, locking eyes with Stan. "You didn't just turn away a dog," he said, voice low but carrying. "You turned away a decorated soldier." The room stilled further, impossibly so. Harrow didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every syllable landed like a gavel. "That dog," he continued, gesturing to the records, "dragged Sergeant Michael Avery out of a collapsed building during a mortar strike in Iraq. Titan remained at his side during evacuation, during surgery, and through every recovery since. He is not a pet, he is not a novelty, he is a veteran, and you humiliated him, in public, for doing what he was trained to do." Stan had opened his mouth, but no words came. His eyes darted to the paper in front of him, then to the cameras now recording from 3 different angles, his shoulders hunched slightly, as if trying to shrink beneath the weight of something he couldn't carry. General Harrow leaned slightly forward. "The next time you think about enforcing a rule," he said, "make sure you understand the cost of what you're enforcing." And then, with absolute clarity, he added, "Because some rules protect people, and some protect our dignity. You failed both." The words settled like dust in the wake of a storm, soft, but everywhere. General Harrow stood with his hand still resting on the counter, not in threat, but in finality. His voice had been calm, even, without anger, but weighted with the gravity of something earned over decades in places most people only saw in headlines, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to be heard. "This isn't about rules," he'd said, looking directly at Stan Whitmore, who now stared at the paperwork before him like it had turned radioactive. "This is about respect. And today, you failed." The room held its breath. Literally. No one moved. A woman near the screws and bolts had her hand clasped over her mouth, frozen mid-step. A boy beside her clutched a shopping basket against his chest as if afraid it might slip. The teenager still holding his phone had stopped recording, not because the moment was over, but because some part of him understood. This wasn't for show anymore. This was justice. Stan swallowed hard. His mouth opened once, then closed. No excuses came. No policy to lean on. He was no longer the man behind the counter dictating terms. He was the one standing bare beneath a truth he hadn't expected to face. The general didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply stood upright and removed a small, framed photo from his briefcase, a photo of Titan in full tactical gear, standing at attention beside Michael Avery and the rest of Bravo Unit. Dust in the air. The word brother etched into the bottom corner in faded ink. He placed it gently on the counter beside the documents, then stepped back. "This is who you turned away," he said, and then, without waiting for a response, he turned. The silence followed him. He passed the cashier, who instinctively nodded, not as a greeting, but as a kind of reverence. He walked past customers whose eyes were now damp, not from guilt, perhaps, but from recognition. Recognition of something sacred they had nearly ignored. Something quiet and loyal and deeply human, wrapped in fur and loyalty and memory. By the time the door opened behind him, no one had moved, and for a moment the only sound was the distant ring of a bell that, hours earlier, had marked an ordinary exit. Now it marked something else entirely. The line between forgetfulness and remembering, between shame and restoration, between a rule followed blindly, and a man who had finally been seen. Michael sat on the same bench where he'd eaten his sandwich the day before, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped. The hardware store was just across the street, quiet and unremarkable on the outside. A small-town shop with dusty windows and a faded sign that had once meant something to the people who lived here. It meant something different now. He hadn't planned to come back. Not really. But something had pulled him here this morning. Something that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite bitterness either. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the need to see if anything had changed. Titan lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, still and alert. But when the black SUV pulled up, when the door opened and the man in full dress uniform stepped out, Titan lifted his head. Then his ears perked up. Michael followed the dog's gaze, squinting into the noon glare. The metals caught the sunlight first, a flash of silver and brass that immediately didn't belong in a place like this. Then the posture, the walk, the unmistakable presence of someone who didn't take up space but held it. Michael's breath caught. Slowly he stood, hand resting briefly on Titan's shoulder. Across the street, the general entered the store. No fanfare. No flashing lights. But the tension shifted, even from this distance. It was like watching the tide come in after a long drought. Michael hadn't asked for this. He hadn't called in favors. He'd kept quiet, as he always had, letting dignity be his only reply to disgrace. He didn't need vindication, not in the loud public sense. All he ever wanted was understanding, space to exist, a table to sit at without being asked to prove the worth of what he carried. But Titan remembered the man. Michael could see it in his eyes, in the subtle twitch of recognition as the dog stood slowly, tail still, posture upright. Not tense, but aware. Not a threat, but a salute. He had once stood guard outside General Harrow's tent, and now, even years later, he remembered the weight of that bond. Michael watched the store's front windows, where movement flickered behind the glass. Something was happening. Something that didn't belong to him, but somehow was about him all the same. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel forgotten. He felt seen. The door to the hardware store swung open, and General Harrow stepped out into the sunlight. The same calm stride, the same unhurried certainty in every step. His uniform still caught the light in places. Shoulder bars, polished shoes, the ribbons that told stories no civilian could ever truly understand. But his eyes weren't on the sidewalk or the SUV waiting quietly at the curb. They were on Michael. Across the street, Michael stood beside the bench, Titan sitting at attention by his side. The dog's ears twitched once, then stood tall, as if instinctively adjusting his posture for something he recognized from a former life. A higher rank, a higher respect. General Harrow waited for a car to pass, then crossed the street, his steps firm but not dramatic. When he reached the edge of the sidewalk, he stopped, squared his shoulders, and brought his hand up in a crisp, deliberate salute. Michael, caught between surprise and instinct, returned it before he even had time to think. Then, with the ease of someone slipping back into a memory that never really faded, General Harrow dropped to one knee, not in submission, but in honor, and placed a hand gently on Titan's broad shoulder. "Good to see you again, Sergeant," he said softly, the words carrying not just across the sidewalk, but across time. Titan leaned forward slightly, not out of playfulness, but out of recognition. He remembered the voice. He remembered the man. Some things, even after years, remain unshakable. Michael cleared his throat. "General," he said, his voice rougher than he'd meant it to be. "I didn't expect—" "You didn't ask," Harrow replied, rising slowly, brushing dust from his knee. "That's what makes it matter." They stood there for a moment, two soldiers in different stages of war, one still carrying the orders, the other still carrying the aftermath. "I'm organizing a veterans event this weekend," Harrow said, his tone shifting slightly, more invitation than command. "Small-town gathering, no cameras, just real people. We could use your voice. Not for ceremony." He nodded toward Titan, "but for memory." Michael hesitated, not out of doubt, but because acceptance is its own kind of courage. "I'm not good with speeches," he finally said. Harrow smiled, just slightly. "You've already given one. Yesterday. With silence." And that somehow was enough. By the next morning, the town looked at Whitmore's hardware differently. What had once been a quiet, dependable fixture on Main Street was now the focus of whispers, conversations held in hushed tones over diner coffee and behind counters. The video had traveled far beyond the town's borders, carried on currents of outrage and reverence, and with it came questions. Not just about what had happened, but about what kind of place they wanted to be. At 9:03 a.m., a printed statement appeared on the hardware store's door. taped hastily, edges curling in the wind. We regret our treatment of Mr. Avery and his service dog, Titan. We failed to uphold the values of dignity, gratitude, and basic human decency. For that, we sincerely apologize. Effective immediately. Whitmore's Hardware welcomes all veterans and their service animals. There was no signature, only the store's letterhead and a trembling sense of shame. By noon, the news broke that Stan Whitmore had resigned. No cameras, no statements. Just a folded note left on the counter, turned over to the assistant manager, an apology written in uneven handwriting and sealed with something like regret. Some said he'd been pressured. Others said he'd left of his own accord. But Michael Avery never asked for either. He didn't need to. What mattered came later that afternoon, when a new sign was bolted into place above the front window. Simple white background, black lettering, no fanfare. Service dogs welcome. Thank you for your service. Beneath it, a small decal bearing the silhouette of a soldier and a canine standing side by side. A few veterans stopped by that day, not to shop necessarily, but to see. Some walked the aisles in silence. One man in a navy ball cap tipped it toward the cashier and left without buying a thing. But his eyes were brighter when he did. The teenager who had recorded the original video stood across the street with a group of friends, phone lowered this time. He didn't film the new sign. He didn't need to. Some moments are meant to be witnessed, not reposted. Inside, the assistant manager rearranged an aisle display with a quiet seriousness, glancing every so often at the door as if expecting someone. Michael never returned that day. He didn't have to. Respect had finally walked in. And this time it stayed. The ceremony wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. A folding stage had been set up in the town park, just beneath the old oak tree where war memorials stood etched in stone, dates and names carefully chiseled into silence. Rows of white chairs formed uneven lines across the grass, filled with townspeople, veterans in faded uniforms, families holding small flags. The breeze was gentle. The sky was clear, the kind of day that felt borrowed from a kinder season. Michael stood near the edge of the crowd, his hand resting lightly on Titan's back. The dog sat perfectly still, eyes alert, body poised. Not in defense, but in respect. He wore his vest today, brushed clean, with a small silver medal clipped just beneath the patch that read Service Animal, PTSD Support. His fur had been groomed, his collar polished. But the pride he carried wasn't visible. It was deeper than that. It was the pride of purpose. The mayor took the microphone first. She was a woman in her 60s, the daughter of a Korean War veteran, and her voice shook not from nerves but from knowing too much about what this meant. Sometimes, she said, glancing toward Michael, our heroes walk on 2 legs, and sometimes they walk on 4. Titan didn't move. A few children near the front clapped, their hands enthusiastic and unaware of how sacred the moment had become. Michael offered a quiet smile, nodding to one boy who wore a plastic army helmet, and saluted without prompting. Then the medal was brought forward, a small circular token mounted to a ribbon of deep blue and gold. It had been crafted hastily by a local metalworker who stayed late 3 nights in a row to finish it. Across its surface, 2 words were engraved in block letters, Loyal Service. Michael crouched beside Titan and clipped the medal gently to his harness. His fingers trembled slightly, not from age or nerves, but from the weight of what it symbolized. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Titan stayed still. A line began to form. Older men, some with canes, some with oxygen tanks, some with nothing but the scars they carried under their sleeves. They shook Michael's hand one by one. Some spoke. Some didn't. A few could only nod, eyes brimming with tears they had spent years learning how to hide. One man in a Marine cap whispered, "You both earned this." Michael looked at Titan. The dog's ears perked slightly. And in that small motion, there was agreement. The bench hadn't changed. The wood was still weathered and splintering in places, the bolts at its base rusted from rain and time, but everything around it felt different now. The park hummed with a quiet kind of warmth, not just from the sun, but from a shift in the air. Something unspoken but undeniably there. Michael sat with one leg stretched out, the other bent just enough to prop his elbow. Titan lay at his feet in his usual position, head resting on crossed paws, his eyes half closed but alert beneath the calm. The metal still clipped to his vest, though Michael had adjusted it so it wouldn't catch in the dog's fur. People passed by, some walking dogs of their own, others holding hands or pushing strollers. But unlike before, they didn't avert their eyes. They didn't whisper or glance sideways. They nodded, some smiled. A few offered a quiet thank you, without breaking stride. Not just to Michael, but to Titan. And Titan, as always, watched them all without judgment, his tail thumping softly once or twice when a child got especially close. Michael didn't need to be the center of attention. He never had. The bench had always been enough, a place to sit, to breathe, to remember. But today it felt like a place returned to him. A boy, maybe 7 or 8, approached slowly. He had a scab on his knee and sneakers that lit up when he walked. He stopped just short of the bench and looked up, blinking with that wide-eyed wonder children carry like armor against the world. "Was he a real soldier?" the boy asked, pointing to Titan. Michael looked down at the dog, then back at the boy. He could have given the easy answer, the simple one, but some truths deserved more than that. "He still is," he said, voice steady, warm. "He just fights different battles now." The boy nodded like he understood, even if he didn't fully. Then he looked at Titan again and raised a hand in a shy salute. Titan didn't move, but his eyes followed the boy with the kind of grace only dogs and old soldiers seem to possess. The boy ran back to his mother. Michael leaned back slightly, his fingers brushing Titan's shoulder. The day was quiet, the kind of quiet he had earned 1,000 times over. And this time, the bench wasn't a place to hide. It was a place to be seen. It was just a plaque. No ceremony marked its arrival. No trumpets, no speeches. Just a few quiet workers in the gray light of early morning, drilling into brick and fastening memory to a wall. The bronze wasn't polished to a shine. It was left with a soft patina, the kind that looks like it's always been there, like it belonged. Etched into its surface, above the silhouette of a soldier and a dog, were the words, "To those who served, walked beside us, and never asked for thanks." Only a place to stand. It wasn't big, it didn't need to be. The people who knew didn't require anything louder. By noon, passers-by had begun to notice. A woman carrying groceries slowed her steps and paused, reading the words in full before pressing her hand against her heart. A teenager skateboarded by, then circled back and snapped a photo, looking at it for a long moment before tucking his phone away without posting. Some left flowers. Others left nothing at all, just silence and breath and thought. Michael saw it for the first time 3 days later. He and Titan came around the corner the way they always had, steady, quiet, with a rhythm only time could teach. Michael hadn't planned on stopping. He just wanted a box of nails and to replace a broken hinge. But when he saw the plaque, he didn't walk past. He stopped. Titan halted at his side without needing a command. The dog's eyes traced the same words Michael did, as if he too understood the meaning behind them. Michael didn't touch the plaque, didn't bow his head or offer prayer. He just stood there, reading each word slowly, letting them settle into the cracks of something long fractured and quietly healing. And then, without fanfare, he nodded. Once. The kind of nod that comes from men who've seen too much to clap and too much to cry. From then on, they came often. Not to be seen, but to see. Others came too. A woman who'd lost a brother in Kandahar. A retired Navy man who walked with a cane and only spoke when he had something worth saying. A young father who knelt with his daughter and whispered, "This is why we stand." Some stayed for minutes. Some stayed for hours. But they came and they returned. Michael would sometimes sit on the bench across the street, Titan lying at his feet, his gray muzzle now nearly white. They watched people stop. They watched people remember. They watched the town shift, not all at once, but steadily. And it was because someone in uniform had walked into a hardware store one afternoon and reminded them that rules can build walls, but respect builds bridges. Now, Michael and Titan were never alone. Veterans nodded as they passed. Children asked questions. Strangers offered a quiet thank you, not out of obligation but out of understanding. And that plaque, small and quiet as it was, made sure no one ever forgot.